Your orchard is in the way of community progress, so deal with it. That's the exact sentence HOA Karen spat at me the day I confronted her about the strange, chemical-smelling water flooding the lower rows of my orchard. 30 years of organic farming, 3 decades of careful soil work, and generations of family history dismissed with one arrogant wave of her hand. The truth hit me fast. That cloudy runoff wasn't rainwater. It was flowing straight from the environmental drainage pond she'd built illegally right above my land, a pond that collected chlorinated pool overflow, fertilizer washout, and whatever else her precious HOA dumped into it. My apple trees were standing in poison. Most people would have broken down, but I felt something sharper, something cold lock into place. Karen hadn't just trespassed, she'd declared war. And if she wanted a war, I was more than ready to show her what happens when you attack a man's land, his legacy, and the soil his father trusted him to protect. Before we get into the full story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. And don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable HOA chaos. I've lived on this land most of my adult life long enough to understand every rise, dip, and contour of the orchard the way a captain knows the shape of his ship. My name's Michael, though most folks around here just call me Mike. Middle-aged, a little gray around the temples, but still strong enough to climb the ladders and haul crates like I did in my 30s. I don't pretend to be special, just a man who works the same soil his father did, and who plans to pass it on one day, the same way it was passed to me. My orchard spans 15 acres of rolling slope, all organic, certified, inspected, and cared for with more patience than most people ever give their own kids. Some trees are older than I am. I know which rows produce sweeter fruit after a rainy week, which sections drain faster after a storm, and which trees need a little more shade in July. It's not just land, it's a living thing, and I've spent decades learning how to protect it. When you've lived somewhere that long, you can feel trouble before it shows up. Usually it's small things, strange cars driving too slowly, contractors surveying the wrong side of the fence, whispers from neighbors about HOA meetings you're not part of. But trouble came loud and proud this time, dressed in a bright pink blazer and designer sunglasses, stepping out of a luxury SUV like she owned the mountain. That was Karen. I first saw her during a community barbecue last spring. She had a confident stride that told everyone she wasn't just part of the HOA, she was the HOA. She talked loudly about community aesthetics and property value enhancement projects, all while flashing thin smiles that felt more like warnings than greetings. She didn't bother introducing herself to me. Later, I learned she didn't think I was relevant to HOA governance. Translation, I wasn't one of her subjects. The funny part, my property isn't even in the HOA. That's right, my orchard. The oldest property on this side of the ridge predates the HOA by decades, which means I don't pay dues, I don't follow their rules, and I sure as hell don't answer to their board. And Karen hated that. It started small. She sent me a friendly notice even though she had no jurisdiction. It said, "Your orchard may be posing a visual inconsistency with the surrounding community standards." I laughed at the sheer audacity. She followed it up with a letter claiming my storage shed did not align with HOA color requirements. My shed had been here since before the HOA founder was born. Then came the surveys. One day I saw 2 contractors standing at my property line with measuring tapes and a tablet. They looked confused when I stepped out of the barn and asked them what they were doing. One of them stammered that they were confirming boundary coordinates for an upcoming project. I told them plainly, "Unless you've got paperwork with my signature, turn around." They left, but not before snapping several photos. I knew exactly whose fingerprints were on that little stunt. Karen didn't hide her ambitions well. She held HOA meetings on her front porch, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Words floated down the hill like toxic pollen. Expansion, beautification, eco-friendly water feature, increased property value. She wanted something big, something flashy, something she could put her name on. And apparently, she thought I was too old, too rural, or too naive to realize what she was planning. One morning, while I was pruning blossoms on the southern rows, I heard the rumble of heavy machinery. Excavators, cement mixers, and trucks scattered across the cul-de-sac near her house like an invading army. A portable fence went up. Bright orange stakes marked the ground. Blueprints were rolled out. Workers shouted instructions. I hiked up the slope to see for myself. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw on that hillside. Karen pointing dramatically at the ground, explaining something to a group of contractors. Her hands kept tracing an oval shape, a pond, a big one. I waited until the workers took a break before approaching. "What exactly are you building?" I asked. She didn't even turn to look at me at first. "A drainage retention pond," she said, waving her hand like she was blessing the land. "It will capture runoff from the community's pool area and landscaping zones, all environmentally friendly, all approved by HOA. I asked the only question that mattered. Where is the outflow directing? She turned then, giving me a smile so fake it practically squeaked. "Downhill, of course. Water runs down. That's just nature. Nature my ass. Downhill meant directly onto my orchard, onto my soil, onto decades of hard work." I tried to stay calm. "Karen, this land is organic certified. Any chemical runoff, pool water, pesticides, anything could destroy my entire certification." She looked at me like I told her I was allergic to sunshine. "Mike, you have to understand, the community comes first. We're improving things for everyone." "For everyone?" I asked. "I'm not even in your HOA." She shrugged, dismissing me with a flick of her wrist. "Well, maybe you should be." As if joining her little fiefdom would magically make chemical runoff safe. I walked back home that day with a storm brewing inside me. Something was wrong, not just with her attitude, but with the way she talked about that pond. I didn't trust a word she said about environmentally friendly, so I started researching, reading permit applications, county code, HOA newsletters, anything I could find. And then I discovered the part she wasn't bragging about. The HOA pool had recently upgraded its cleaning system, more chemicals, higher chlorine output, larger filtration cycles. And where would all that excess water go? Straight into her shiny new pond. I knew then what Karen had been plotting all along. She wanted a showpiece project, something the HOA could plaster on brochures and brag about online, a natural water feature. But instead of building it safely, she chose the cheapest option, funneling every drop of treated water into a pond built directly above my orchard. She didn't just ignore the risk. She chose to ignore it. And that made her dangerous. The next few weeks were a tense waiting game. Construction trucks roared up and down the cul-de-sac. The ground shook as they dug the basin for the pond. I watched from the ridge like a man guarding the last line of defense. Every shovel of dirt they moved made my jaw tighten. Neighbors whispered their admiration. "Karen really knows how to make improvements. It's going to look amazing. She's such a visionary leader." They didn't see the danger. Or maybe they didn't want to. Karen strutted around like the queen of the mountain, giving instructions, posing for photos, boasting about her eco project. She even tried to wave at me once, like we were old friends. I didn't wave back. When they finally lined the pond and installed the drainage pipes, I knew things were about to get very real. One pipe in particular pointed like a loaded gun straight toward my orchard. They buried it with soil, but I'd seen enough. The final straw? Karen walked to the edge of her property one afternoon and called down to me. "When this project is done," she shouted, "you'll finally understand how much this community is improving." I didn't respond. Fear mixed with anger, twisting deep in my gut. If she was right, I'd understand, but not the way she imagined. If that pond overflowed or drained the wrong way, every tree my father planted would be at risk. Every apple we harvested, every certification earned through years of sacrifice. And Karen didn't care. She didn't care about the land, the history, or the truth. She cared about applause, she cared about being admired, and she cared about winning, even if it meant destroying everything I'd built. I walked the rows of my orchard that evening, touching the bark of the trees like they were family. The sun set slowly behind the ridge, painting the sky orange. I made myself a promise right there. If Karen wanted to turn my orchard into collateral damage for her ego, I would make sure she paid for it. Not with anger, not with violence, but with truth. And with evidence strong enough to take down her pond, her project, and her entire HOA empire. The first real sign that things were about to get worse came on a windy Tuesday morning. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I noticed a white HOA envelope sticking out of my mailbox like it was trying to escape. HOA mail is always bad news, even when you're not part of the HOA, especially when Karen is running the show. I pulled it out. already knowing I wasn't going to like whatever was inside. The letter was typed in a tone so smug I could practically hear Karen's voice narrating it. It read, "Notice of community concern. Your orchard may present visual obstruction and aesthetic inconsistencies. Immediate review is required." I laughed out loud. Aesthetic inconsistencies? My orchard was here before any of their pastel-colored mansions, before the overpriced landscaping, before the HOA was even a scribble on a legal form. But Karen didn't care about history. She cared about control. And I could tell she'd been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to put pressure on me. I thought ignoring the letter would send a message that I wasn't buying into her nonsense. But just 2 days later, a second letter arrived, this one more aggressive. Failure to comply may result in a formal HOA action. Formal action? Against someone who wasn't even a member? Karen was so used to pushing people around that she didn't bother checking jurisdiction. She assumed she was queen of anything she could see from her porch. I considered walking up to her house right then and there just to set things straight. But something told me to wait. People like Karen always reveal their true intentions when they think they're winning. And sure enough, the real move came a week later. I was loading crates into the back of my truck when I heard voices near the southern fence, line low, clipped, professional-sounding voices. I crept through the trees until I saw 2 men wearing reflective vests carrying surveying equipment. They were walking the perimeter like they were checking measurements. Their tablet screens glowed with boundary lines. My boundary lines. Except their map wasn't quite right. They had extended their digital plot several feet into my property. I stepped out of the brush. "You boys lost?" I asked. The younger one jumped. The older one stiffened, straightening his back. "We're conducting a community infrastructure assessment," he said. I asked for paperwork. They said the HOA had authorized it. I told them the HOA had no authority on my land. The men exchanged uneasy glances, quietly packed up their equipment, and hightailed it out of there. But they'd already done what they came to do. Verify that the slope from Karen's drainage pond lined up perfectly with the downward path into my orchard. And if the contractors knew that, then Karen definitely knew it too. Later that afternoon, I stood on the upper ridge and watched Karen walking the hillside with her tablet tucked under her arm. Her oversized sunglasses practically covered half her face, but I knew that air of superiority. She was pointing at the freshly surveyed ground, talking excitedly to another HOA board member, Laura, the one who always trailed behind Karen like a loyal shadow. They nodded, gestured, laughed like 2 villains plotting a takeover. And that's when I realized Karen wasn't just building a water feature. She was laying the groundwork for a power grab, a big one. That drainage pond was step 1 of her community improvement master plan. I'd overheard neighbors saying she wanted to turn this whole side of the hill into a scenic walking trail, complete with benches, decorative lights, and signage that screamed HOA property. My orchard stood directly in the way of that plan, and she knew she couldn't touch my land legally, so she was trying to devalue it, undermine its safety, maybe even force it into condemnation. If she couldn't buy my land, she'd try to ruin it. A few days later, Karen decided to escalate in the pettiest way imaginable. I was repairing irrigation lines near the eastern rows when she strutted down the paved path with that clipboard she always carried, like the world's most aggressive hall monitor. She called out, "Mike, I need to speak to you about a violation." I didn't respond at first. I was trying to decide whether to laugh or tell her to walk back up the hill before she sprained her entitlement. But she kept talking. "Your orchard shed is not compliant with the approved color palette." I stood up slowly. "Approved by who?" She flashed her brightest fake smile. "The HOA, of course." "I'm not in your HOA." "Oh, but your property is visible to the community," she said, tapping her clipboard. And visual harmony is essential. It affects property values. So you're telling me my shed is ruining property values? Of houses that look like Instagram filters exploded on them?" Her smile twitched. A vein near her left temple pulsed. "The shed must be repainted," she insisted. "Preferably beige or sandstone. Something neutral." I scratched my chin. "Karen, my shed has been red since the 1980s. A barn-red barn is kind of the point." She crossed her arms. "You're being unreasonable." "Reasonable," I said, "would be you staying on your side of the hill." She stormed off in a huff, muttering something about non-compliant residents. But it wasn't over, not even close. A week later, without warning, construction trucks filled the cul-de-sac again. Workers unloaded pipes, gravel, and massive rolls of liner material. The pond was expanding. Not just in width deeper, reinforced professional grade. Karen was pouring serious money into this thing, enough to raise alarm bells in my head. Then came the kicker. A bright yellow sign planted on the hill read, HOA Improvement Area. No trespassing. It sat so close to my property line, I could have knocked it over with a rake. That's when the unexpected happened. Karen approached Menno with threats this time, but with something far worse, false politeness. She walked down the slope in a flowy blouse, like she was hosting a garden party instead of waging a property war. "Mike," she said sweetly, "we should talk." I didn't respond. She continued anyway. "I just want what's best for the community. Once the new drainage pond is finished, it's going to increase home values. Everyone benefits." "Everyone except the guy whose land you're dumping water onto," I said. Karen sighed dramatically. "You exaggerate. It's just water. From your pool," I pointed out. "From your fertilizers. From your landscaped chemical cocktails." She waved her hand. "That's all natural. Water evaporates. Water flows. You can't control nature." I stepped closer. "Karen, you are building a man-made chemical soup above an organic orchard." She paused, staring at me like she couldn't decide if I was stupid or stubborn. "Well," she finally said, "maybe you shouldn't have such unrealistic farming standards. The world has moved on." My jaw locked. Organic standards aren't unrealistic. They're the foundation of my business. Karen gave me a pitying look, the kind someone gives a child who's telling a silly story. "Someday you'll understand what real progress looks like." Then she turned and walked back up the hill, already dialing someone, probably the HOA board, ready to brag about how she'd handled the orchard situation. Something inside me shifted that day. I'd always been a patient man. Farming requires patience, seasons, cycles, slow growth. But patience has its limit when someone is intentionally trying to destroy everything you built, and Karen wasn't finished yet. 2 mornings later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A team of contractors was installing a secondary pipeline, snaking down from the pond's outflow area, pointing unmistakably toward my orchard. They buried it quickly, maybe thinking I wouldn't notice. But I'd been watching the ground for 30 years. I notice everything. A storm rolled in that afternoon. Heavy clouds, dark sky, thunder rumbling behind the ridge. I knew the rain would test the new system, so I grabbed my coat, my flashlight, and my boots, and waited. When the rain hit, it hit hard. Water poured off the hillside. I braced myself against the wind and slogged up the slope. Standing at the edge of Karen's property, in the downpour, I saw it. Water gushing from the lower pipe like a burst artery. A waterfall of murky runoff surging directly toward the southern rows of my orchard. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And from the look of the flow, it had been engineered that way. My orchard was in danger. My land was under attack. And Karen had no idea what kind of storm she had just unleashed. Rain has a way of telling the truth. You can hide a pipe, you can bury lines, you can disguise runoff with landscaping. But when the sky opens up, everything reveals itself. And on that stormy night, the truth came pouring down the hill like a confession. I stood there, soaked to the bone, listening to the roar of water blasting out of Karen's newly installed outflow pipe. It didn't just trickle. It didn't merely overflow. It surged in a violent stream, cutting through soil, dragging mulch, gravel, and whatever chemical mix the HOA used in their eco-maintenance program. The water fanned out across the southern rows of my orchard, forming shallow rivers between the trees. I splashed forward through the mud, crouching near the stream, and caught a handful of the runoff. It smelled sharp like chlorine mixed with synthetic fertilizers. My stomach tightened as the realization hit. This wasn't just rainwater. It carried chemicals from the HOA's pool, communal landscaping, and who knows what else. My orchard wasn't just getting wet, it was getting poisoned. Even in the fading light, I could see subtle changes in the leaves on the lower trees' edges curling slightly, some already yellowing in ways that didn't match the season. It only took a day or two for chemical damage to show up, and judging by the volume of water coming down the hill, the trees had been drinking it in faster than I could have imagined. I ran my fingers through the soil. The dirt felt slick, unnaturally smooth. Healthy organic soil has texture, crumbly, alive, breathing. This felt dead, suffocated. A flash of lightning illuminated the hillside, and in that split second of white light, I noticed movement at the top of the slope. Karen stood under her porch awning, arms crossed, a hood pulled over her head. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't alarmed. She was watching. Watching as runoff from her project washed into my orchard. Watching as my land absorbed toxins. Watching as everything my father and I had built fell under threat. And she said nothing. The next morning, I woke early and walked the orchard before sunrise. The rain had stopped, but the ground still squished under my boots. Patches of standing water mirrored the dawn sky. I moved from tree to tree, checking the lower rows. The damage wasn't dramatic yet, but it was undeniable. A few leaves had changed color overnight. Fruit that should have been firm felt softer to the touch. I felt anger rising like heat from the earth. Anger, and something else, fear. Not for myself, but for the orchard. For the trees that depended on me to keep them safe. For the legacy my father left behind. Chemical contamination is like wildfire. Once it starts, it spreads fast. I needed proof. Solid proof. So I gathered water samples in sterile jars, carefully marking each one with the exact location and time. I took photos close-ups of leaves, patches of odd discoloration in the soil, and the muddy stream that carved its way from the hillside. I even mapped it out using GPS tracking on my phone, marking the flow path. Around mid-morning, I heard a vehicle pulling up. I turned to see Karen walking toward the fence line with that familiar, "I'm here to supervise" posture. She had an umbrella, even though the rain had stopped hours ago. Of course she did. Karen never came outside unless she had the chance to look superior. "Morning, Mike," she said, voice bright and fake. "Quite a storm last night." I didn't answer at first. I just looked at her, waiting to see if she'd even pretend to care about the obvious water damage. She glanced around casually, like she was touring a museum exhibit she didn't understand. "You know, water runoff is perfectly natural after heavy rain," she said. "I hope you're not planning to blame the HOA for bad weather." I stepped closer. "You installed a pipe, Karen. A pipe that channels pool water and landscaping chemicals straight into my orchard." She laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Mike, don't be dramatic. The HOA uses eco-friendly treatments." "Karen," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "Chlorine isn't eco-friendly." She shrugged. "It evaporates. Science." "No," I said firmly. "It drains into soil. My soil." Her expression hardened. "Well, maybe if your orchard wasn't right in the drainage path, we wouldn't have this problem. Your drainage path wasn't here before you built the pond." I shot back. She lifted her chin. "The HOA board approved our design. Everything is up to code." Then she added with a little smirk, "I don't think you'd want to challenge the HOA on this. It won't end well for you." There it was. A threat thinly veiled, but unmistakable. I took a step closer. "I've been on this land longer than your HOA has existed. You may bully your board members and neighbors, but you're not bullying me." Her face twitched, a sign I'd hit a nerve. "Mike," she said, voice tight, "all I want is for our community to improve. If a little runoff touches your orchard touches," I interrupted, "it's drowning." She rolled her eyes. "You're overreacting. Honestly, you farmers get emotional over everything." For a brief moment, I genuinely thought I might lose my temper. But I didn't. Losing my temper wouldn't help my orchard. It wouldn't stop the contamination, and it wouldn't win the battle I knew was coming. So, instead, I said, "I've collected samples. I'll get them tested." Karen blinked, the first sign of real concern crossing her face. "Tested? Tested for what? For chlorine levels? For chemical residues? For proof?" Karen shook her head like she was brushing away a fly. "You're wasting your time. Even if you think there's contamination, the HOA is protected. Everything we do is documented and approved." "Good," I said, "because I'm documenting everything too." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like that. Karen loved oversight when she was the one overseeing, but the idea of someone gathering evidence against her, that rattled her. She spun around and walked back up the hill, heels digging into the soft ground. I watched her go, rainwater still dripping from the slope like the land itself was trying to warn me. That afternoon, I drove into town with my jars of water and soil. The environmental lab technician recognized Mesmal Community's work like that and promised to run the tests as soon as possible. I spent the next 2 days on edge, pacing the orchard, watching every leaf like it was a sick child. The damage grew clearer, more yellowing, more wilting. A few young apples had fallen prematurely. My stomach twisted with each new sign. Then the call came. The technician's voice was careful, too careful. "Mike, those water samples from your property, they're showing 2.8 to 3.4 parts per million of chlorine." I closed my eyes. "That's catastrophic." "For organic soil?" he said. "Yes, very." The moment I hung up, the weight of the truth slammed into me. My orchard, my life's work, was officially contaminated. Organic certification doesn't bend. No wiggle room, no appeals, one strike, and decades of trust vanish. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I walked the orchard alone. The air smelled damp and faintly chemical. Some trees looked sick, others looked confused, as if unsure how to respond to the sudden shock. I stopped at one of the oldest trees, a tall, sturdy apple tree my father planted with his own hands. I rested my palm against its trunk. "I'm going to fix this," I whispered. "I swear." Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross. This wasn't a dispute anymore. This was war, and I wasn't going to lose. When I finally decided to confront Karen directly, I didn't plan it as some dramatic showdown. I told myself it would be calm, rational, straightforward. Just two adults discussing a serious problem. But anyone who's ever dealt with a full-blown HOA tyrant knows reasoning with someone like Karen is about as productive as explaining taxes to a brick wall. Still, I had to try, because the situation had escalated beyond whispers, beyond suspicions, beyond inconvenient water pooling. My orchard was officially contaminated. And people like Karen only understood conflict once it was staring them straight in the face. I walked up the hill toward her house around sunset. The HOA mansion, because let's call it what it was, towered over the cul-de-sac like a queen's castle. High windows, expensive stone facade, decorative iron railing, and a porch she used like a throne. I found her right where I expected, standing on that porch with a glass of chilled white wine, swirling it like she'd just survived another exhausting day of bullying innocent neighbors. "Karen," I called out. She turned slowly, giving me a smile that could only be described as hostile politeness. "Mike." "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I got the lab results," I said. "The runoff from your drainage pond is loaded with chlorine, enough to kill soil microbes, enough to damage fruit, enough to suspend my organic certification." Her expression didn't change, at least not at first. She sipped her wine, lifted one eyebrow, and said, "Well, I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. Maybe your orchard just isn't as hardy as you think it is." I stepped closer. "My orchard has survived droughts, storms, freezes, and pests. It's not fragile, it's poisoned." She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Mike, you are being dramatic again. You always assume the worst. You're diverting chemically treated water into agricultural land," I said. "That isn't assuming the worst. That's describing reality." Karen leaned against a porch column, tapping her nails against the stone. "Look, the HOA hired professionals, licensed contractors. The system is completely legal. Legal doesn't mean safe." She sighed loudly, as if the burden of my existence weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Mike, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. A little runoff isn't the end of the world. It's the end of my certification." "Oh, please," she said with a roll of her eyes. "You can just reapply or rebrand as non-organic. People will still buy apples. My customers buy organic for a reason, and reapplying takes years, years I can't afford to lose." She shrugged, actually shrugged. "That's not my problem." For a moment, I didn't speak. The audacity of her words hung in the air, choking the space between us. She didn't even pretend to care. Not 1 ounce of compassion. Not even basic human decency. To her, my orchard wasn't land. It wasn't heritage. It wasn't my livelihood. It was an obstacle, something in the way of her vision. "I'm giving you a chance," I said slowly. "Fix the drainage, redirect it, stop the contamination." Karen crossed her arms. "And what if I don't? Then I take legal action." Her eyes narrowed. "Legal action?" She laughed again, a sharp and almost metallic sound. "Mike, do you think you can actually win a case against the HOA? I have evidence." "And the HOA has lawyers," she snapped. "Real ones, expensive ones. You think your little orchard can go up against a full homeowners association?" "If that's what it takes," I said. "Yes." Something flickered in her eyes. Then fear, or maybe rage, or maybe both. She set her wineglass down hard enough that the stem nearly snapped. You don't get it, do you? The community supports this project. Everyone wants the pond. Everyone agrees with me. What they want, I said, and what's legal are two different things. She stepped closer until we were only a few feet apart. You think you can scare me with your jars of water, your little tests? Newsflash, Mike, the county approved our plans. The county approved incomplete plans, I said. They weren't told about the outflow pipe. They weren't told your pond would channel chemicals downhill. Karen's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected me to know that. She had no idea I'd spent the last week reviewing every public record, every building permit, every engineering diagram. You are playing a dangerous game, she whispered. No, I corrected. You are. I'm just cleaning up the mess. We stood in silence for a moment, the tension buzzing like power lines. I could see her calculating, trying to decide whether intimidation or charm was the better tactic. Eventually, she chose intimidation. Mike, she said, voice low and cold, consider this your last warning. If you take another step to interfere with this project, the HOA will file a cease and desist. We will pursue damages, and I will personally ensure you pay every penny. I almost laughed. Damages? For what? Protecting my own property? She smiled. Not kindly, not warmly, but cruelly, for defamation, for harassment, for obstruction, for whatever I want. When you have influence, you'd be amazed at what you can classify as a violation. You're threatening to weaponize the HOA. I'm promising it, she corrected. At that moment, something inside me hardened. Not anger, not fear, but resolve. You can break a fence. You can tear up a road. You can flood land. But once you break a man's resolve, you lose. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd just lost. I'll see you in court, I said simply. Then I turned and walked away. But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, I found a fresh stack of HOA envelopes in my mailbox. Violations, warnings, demands, everything from unauthorized farming structures to visual obstruction to community paths. Half of it didn't even make sense. One notice accused me of non-compliant grass height, even though I didn't have grass, I had trees. They were drowning me in paperwork, harassment by bureaucracy. But I kept my cool. I filed every piece of paper. I documented everything. I didn't throw away a single letter. HOA bullies rely on intimidation. They crumble under proof. 2 days later, the county inspector showed up. Karen had filed a complaint that I was constructing unauthorized water retention wells. The inspector walked the orchard with me, looked around and said, "This is clearly nonsense." He wrote his report, closed the case, and apologized for the inconvenience. Karen wasn't happy. That evening, as I checked the northern rows, I heard footsteps on gravel. I turned to see her stomping down the slope, face red, eyes blazing. "Did you tell the inspector I'm filing false reports?" she demanded. "No," I said calmly. "He figured that out himself." "This is harassment. This is survival," I replied. "You poison my land. You think I'm just going to lie down and take it?" She clenched her fists. "The HOA will not let this slide." I looked her dead in the eye, and neither will I. Karen stormed back up the hill like a furious toddler denied a toy. I watched her go, my heart pounding but my mind sharper than ever. She wanted war. Fine. I wasn't scared of her. I wasn't scared of her board. I wasn't scared of her threats. Because I had truth on my side, and truth leaves a trail I was about to follow all the way to destroying her project and her precious HOA empire from the inside out. Hiring a lawyer wasn't something I took lightly. I'm not the type who runs to attorneys every time a neighbor's dog barks too loudly or someone puts their trash cans out a few hours early. But this wasn't a petty dispute. This was my land, my livelihood, my father's legacy, and Karen was poisoning it without hesitation. I needed someone who understood environmental law, property boundaries, water rights, and maybe, if possible, the psychology of a tyrannical HOA president. Enter Daniel Keats. Daniel was a sharp, no-nonsense environmental attorney who'd once sued a mining company so brutally they shut down an entire division. When he shook my hand for the first time, he said, "If they've violated water codes, we'll find it. If they've contaminated your property, we'll prove it. And if they've lied, well, that's where things get fun." Exactly the kind of guy I needed. We met at my kitchen table, stacks of photos, water samples, and notes spread across the wood. Daniel examined everything with the kind of intensity usually reserved for bomb defusal experts. "You've done half my job already," he said, tapping one of the water test reports. "Chlorine levels this high? HOA is cooked if we prove the runoff came from their pond, but we need more. We need footage, flow patterns, dates, times, consistency." "I've got all that," I said, handing him my notebook. He flipped through it, eyebrows rising. "You're thorough. When my land is on the line," I replied, "I don't leave things to chance." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "Good. Because if Karen is as stubborn as you say, she'll fight this tooth and nail. We need indisputable evidence." So that's exactly what I set out to gather. Over the next week, I became part farmer, part detective. I installed trail cameras along the ridge high-resolution ones with night vision and motion triggers. I placed them strategically, near the outflow pipe, the hillside slope, the pond's edge, and along the orchard's water path. Every camera angle captured a different perspective of the problem. The first night, rain returned. Not heavy, but steady enough to activate the outflow system. The cameras caught everything: water gushing down, carrying debris and swirling with that unnatural cloudy tint. One frame even captured a reflection of the HOA pool lights on the surface of the runoff, proof that the water wasn't just rain, but a mix of overflows. I spent hours reviewing the footage, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp. By morning, I had solid video evidence from multiple angles. Daniel was thrilled. "This," he said, pointing at one clear shot of the pipe spewing water, "is the kind of thing that turns mediation into surrender." But I wasn't stopping there. I walked to the orchard daily, documenting each affected tree. Photos, leaf samples, fruit samples, soil degradation of it carefully logged. I used GPS markers to map the exact path the water took as it flowed down the hill. The pattern was unmistakable, a perfect line from Karen's pond to my orchard's lowest point. Meanwhile, Karen continued parading around the community as if she were a queen. She held HOA meetings on her patio, loud enough for half the neighborhood to overhear. Phrases like community beautification, environmental leadership, and Karen's pond project drifted down the hill like toxic fumes. One afternoon, as I was adjusting one of the trail cameras, I heard voices and ducked behind a row of apple trees. Karen was walking the ridge with two HOA board members, Laura and Weston. They stopped near the drainage pipe. Laura looked uneasy. Weston took photos like he was documenting evidence for a glossy brochure. Karen said, "This is the crown jewel of our improvement plan. Once we finish the landscaping, this whole hillside will look like a resort." Laura pointed hesitantly toward my orchard. "But what about the concerns he raised, about runoff?" Karen cut her off sharply. "There is no runoff problem. He's exaggerating. We used eco-safe materials. But the water—" "Laura," Karen snapped, "don't make this harder. Everything is legal. The board approved the project." "I didn't approve chlorine runoff," Laura said quietly. Karen's voice went ice cold, "and you didn't disapprove it." That was all I needed to hear. Their own board was uneasy, but Karen bullied them into submission. I stepped out from behind the trees before they walked away. "Karen," I called. All three froze. Karen turned slowly, her face twisting into an annoyed smile. "Yes?" she asked sweetly. "I'd love to get a copy of that board approval," I said, keeping my tone calm. "The one that covers your drainage system." Her jaw tightened. "Why would you need that?" "For my records, you're not entitled to HOA documents," she said. "I'm entitled to any document that pertains to where your water goes." Laura looked between us, visibly uncomfortable. Weston suddenly found the ground fascinating. Karen said, "The HOA doesn't respond to intimidation." I smiled. "That's fine. My lawyer will ask instead." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Lawyer?" "Environmental attorney," I corrected. "Very good at finding hidden clauses and lies." For the first time, Karen's confidence faltered. Just a flicker. But I saw it. She huffed and turned away. "This conversation is over." But while Karen walked off, Laura lingered a moment, glancing at me with something that looked like guilt. She whispered, barely audible, "Be careful, be careful." When HOA board members start whispering warnings, you know something rotten is happening. Later that evening, I received an anonymous text. "Check the HOA project budget. Something doesn't add up. There was no name, no number, just that message, and I knew exactly who it came from. Daniel and I dug into the records. What we found was explosive. The HOA had submitted one set of plans to the county plans, showing a safe, sealed drainage system with no chemical exposure. But the contractors had built something completely different. Cheaper, faster, hazardous. The HOA saved tens of thousands. And Karen bragged about sticking to budget. But here's the twist. Emails revealed that the original safe design required rerouting the drainage away from my property. Karen rejected it, saying it was too expensive and would delay the aesthetic timeline. She didn't just ignore the risk. She chose the dangerous option. She knowingly funneled chemicals into my orchard because it saved money and made her project look successful. Daniel looked at me across my kitchen table, tapping the printed emails with a pen. This, he said, is negligence. This is liability. And if we present it right, this is the HOA's worst nightmare. I sat back, letting the weight of the truth settle over me like dust. Karen had gone from clueless tyrant to willful saboteur. She didn't just fail to prevent damage, she caused it, on purpose. And that changed everything. 2 days later, I installed large signs along the ridge. Signs that read, "Orchard contaminated by HOA drainage," evidence being documented for legal action. I made sure the signs faced the walking path Karen used for her community tours. I mounted the trail cameras more visibly. Let her see them. Let her sweat. Because from now on, every step she took, every decision she made, every lie she told would be documented. She played this game thinking she was untouchable. But I had truth, video, data, and an environmental lawyer with a spine of steel. Karen wouldn't be winning anymore. The war had officially turned. The morning of the HOA's Grand Community Improvement Tour came faster than I expected. Karen had spent the entire week hyping it up, like she was launching a luxury resort. Invitations had been sent out to local real estate agents, architects from the city, interior design bloggers, and a handful of homeowners who were gullible enough to believe the HOA was about to unveil the next big thing. The moment I saw the catering truck pull up to her driveway, I knew Karen intended to put on a spectacle. But she had made one mistake, a crucial one. She thought this tour would happen on her terms. She assumed everyone walking through her meticulously curated, HOA-polished world would see exactly what she wanted them to see. That's where she underestimated me. At sunrise, I walked the lower rows of the orchard, checking the trees one last time before the show. The effects of the contamination were clearer than ever. Leaves had browned in irregular patterns, some fruit had dropped early, soil patches looked bleached. To anyone who knew a thing about farming, it would be obvious that something unnatural was happening here. Perfect. Because today, plenty of people would see it. I positioned the signs more strategically, angled just right so they'd catch the eye from Karen's pond terrace and the upper trail. The bold letters stood out like warning flares. Organic orchard damaged by unlawful HOA runoff. Documentation in progress. The trail cameras blinked red whenever they detected motion, each tiny flash a reminder that truth doesn't hide. And finally, I set up a cluster of equipments, hovels, buckets, markers, right in the middle of the most visibly harmed section of the orchard. Not staged, just honest work. But well-timed. As guests began arriving uphill, I could hear the cheerful chatter drifting down the slope. Laughter, small talk. Compliments about the scenery. The kind of surface-level excitement that happens before reality hits. Karen's voice stood out above the rest, dripping with pride. "This way, right this way. Welcome to our showcase of modern HOA environmental design." I almost snorted. Environmental design? Yeah. If you counted ecological destruction as a design goal, I positioned myself where the orchard dipped low enough to offer a perfect upward view. Sure enough, as guests stepped onto the pond terrace, several immediately noticed the signs down the slope. One woman squinted, shading her eyes. A man beside her muttered something and leaned closer to read. Karen followed their gaze, and her smile froze, then faltered, then reappeared far too quickly. "Oh, that," she said loudly, "is simply a neighbor stirring up trouble. Not important." She tried to usher them away, but the human brain is funny tell people not to look, and they stare harder. I began trimming a sick tree, making the movement slow, deliberate, visible. Another guest pointed toward me. "Is that the orchard Karen mentioned?" he asked. "The organic one?" Karen stiffened. It's not relevant to the tour, she said. Let's move along. But curiosity is contagious, especially among people who pride themselves on being informed. Soon more guests leaned over the railing, whispering, speculating. One finally asked what everyone else was thinking. Why does it say contaminated down there? Karen exhaled sharply. Miscommunication, she insisted. Just a dramatic farmer making a fuss. I'd had enough. I walked toward the slope where they could see me clearly. It's not miscommunication, I said loudly enough to carry uphill. Your HOA runoff killed my soil. The whole terrace fell silent. Karen spun around, eyes blazing. Mike, she hissed, this is a private event. And your drainage pond isn't, I replied. It's public enough to poison my land. A man wearing a crisp button-down shirt stepped closer to the railing. Excuse me, he called out. Is the chlorine contamination real? Before Karen could speak, I held up one of the test reports. Independent lab results, I said. 3.2 parts per million chlorine runoff. Enough to destroy organic certification. Another woman gasped. Certification? You're organic? I nodded. Was. 30 years. The correct gone in weeks. Karen's face went red. This is slander, she snapped. Absolute slander. He's exaggerating. The pond is eco-friendly. One of the architects jerked his head toward the pond. Eco-friendly? That liner is commercial grade, but I see no filtration system. None at all. And that outflow pipe, was it inspected? Karen sputtered. Of course it was. By professionals. Which firm? He asked. She froze. Her mouth opened, but the name didn't come out. Several guests exchanged glances. Nothing turns a crowd faster than the smell of dishonesty. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A young woman in hiking boots, holding a notepad and camera, spoke up. I'm with Northwest Design Journal, she said calmly. We cover sustainable architecture. Would you mind if I take a closer look? Karen practically screamed, no, but her refusal was too abrupt, too desperate. The guests sensed it. And now they wanted answers. A few of them asked if they could walk down the path to see the orchard up close. I didn't stop them. I simply stepped aside and let them pass. Karen tried to block them, placing herself in front of the trail, but one of the more assertive men brushed past her. If there's an environmental concern, he said, we have a right to see it. You have no right, Karen shouted. This path is private HOA property. Funny, I said quietly. That didn't stop your runoff from entering my land. And that was it. The dam broke figuratively. Guests hurried down the slope, careful but curious. They gasped as they examined the trees, touched the soil, and studied the waterlogged patches. One man knelt beside a puddle, sniffed it, then recoiled. That's chlorine, he said. Strong, too. Another woman photographed the yellowed leaves. The journalist took dozens of pictures, asking thoughtful questions, documenting everything. Karen rushed downhill, waving her arms like a frantic traffic conductor. Stop taking pictures! Delete those photos! This is trespassing! But nobody listened. Her desperation only made her look guilty. When she tried to grab the journalist's camera, the woman stepped back sharply. Ma'am, she said firmly, touch me again and you'll be the headline. Up on the terrace, more guests leaned over the railing, murmuring. One whispered, this is bad. Another said, this could be a lawsuit. Someone else added, the HOA approved this? Karen spun toward me with a glare so sharp it could slice through glass. You're sabotaging my event. I didn't sabotage anything, I said. You did. Months ago, the board members arrived late to the disaster. Laura looked horrified when she saw the water damage. Weston looked like he wanted to melt into the hillside. Guests surrounded them with questions. Why was the pond draining onto private land? Had they known about contamination risks? Why wasn't there proper filtration? Why was Karen stopping people from documenting the issue? Laura tried to explain, but the words came out faltering, too vague to reassure anyone. Then the architect from earlier stepped forward with finality. He pointed at the outflow pipe and said, this is a major design oversight, possibly negligent. That statement alone was enough to tilt the room well, hillside against Karen. Guests who had arrived eager to praise her vision now looked disgusted, disappointed, even angry. One couple walked straight back to their car. Another group followed, muttering about misleading advertising and false environmental claims. Karen's entire event collapsed before her eyes. By the next morning, it wasn't just local gossip. Photos had circulated online. The Design Journal posted a short teaser article hinting at environmental neglect by an HOA project. A regional architecture blog shared pictures from the terrace view, with my signs in clear focus. Comments poured in. People wanted answers. Karen tried doing damage control on the HOA community page, claiming baseless accusations and coordinated attacks from disgruntled non-members. But with every defensive post she made, more screenshots surfaced, more evidence, more public scrutiny. Her empire built on intimidation and aesthetic delusions was cracking. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt momentum shift. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in justice. Karen had pushed me, bullied me, poisoned my orchard, and mocked my livelihood. But the truth had finally found an audience bigger than her HOA board, and truth had a way of echoing uphill. By the time the dust from Karen's botched tour settled, something in her had cracked. She'd always strutted around with the confidence of a queen who believed every subject adored her. But after the disaster on the hillside, after the photos, the whispers, the architect calling her project negligent, she looked different, less collected, less invincible, almost shaken. But shaken didn't mean defeated. People like Karen don't admit defeat. They double down. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of trucks grinding their way up the road again. Not media trucks this time, construction trucks. I looked up the ridge through my kitchen window and saw crews unloading mounds of dirt near the drainage pipe. A bulldozer, 2 cement mixers, and at least a dozen workers were already spreading out across the slope like an army preparing for siege. Karen was there too, pacing the hillside with a clipboard clutched in white-knuckled hands. She barked orders, pointed at the soil, waved her arms like she was directing a military offensive. She didn't even look toward my orchard. That told me everything. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She was trying to cover it up. I walked up the slope to see exactly what she was planning. As I approached, a contractor spread out some orange cones and held up a hand. "Sorry, sir," he said. "HOA project zone, no access." I ignored him and kept walking. Karen spun around, her face flushing the moment she saw me. "You can't be here, Mike," she snapped. "This is an active construction site." "I know," I said calmly. "That's why I'm here. What are you building this time? Another eco-friendly chemical slip and slide aimed at my orchard?" Her nostrils flared. "We're improving the hillside drainage, as is our right. The runoff you complained about was weather-related. We're reinforcing the berms to contain natural water flow." I looked at the mountain of dirt, the trenches, the new pipeline coils stacked beside them. "You're trying to bury the evidence." She stiffened. "Excuse me? You think you can dump 5 tons of soil over the outflow pipe, block the camera's view, and pretend the whole thing never happened?" "It did never happen," she said. "It was fabricated to humiliate me." One of the contractors paused mid-shovel, glancing between us with raised eyebrows. I stepped closer. "Karen, your pond overflow contaminated my orchard. I have water tests, GPS flow paths, soil analysis, and video footage. I don't care," she suddenly screamed. The construction crew froze. Birds scattered from the nearby trees. Even the bulldozer engine seemed to hesitate. Karen's voice dropped to a trembling growl. "I don't care what you claim. I don't care what you think you saw. I don't care what you filmed. The HOA will protect me. We have lawyers, we have resources, and we will bury you in paperwork until you give up." "You already buried my land," I said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere." She stared at me for a long second, something flickering in her eyes, rage, panic, or maybe the first flicker of fear that the world wasn't bending the way she wanted. Karen turned back to the workers, yelling, "Cover every exposed section. Add more soil. I want that slope reinforced before the end of the day." I walked back down the hill, but as I reached the orchard, I heard a sound water, rushing water, and not from the main outflow pipe. A thin stream was cutting down a new path on the far end of the slope. Karen's reinforcement had backfired. All the extra soil they were tossing around had redirected the water, not stopped it. The runoff was now carving a deeper, faster route, straight toward another section of my orchard, one that hadn't been damaged yet. I shouted up the hill, "You're making it worse! Stop the machines!" But Karen yelled back, "Mind your own property!" I grabbed a shovel from beside the barn and raced toward the water's path. I tried digging a quick trench to divert the flow away from the roots, but the volume was too strong. Muddy water ripped through the fresh trench, spraying my boots, splashing my pants, soaking the soil. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't runoff. This was a flood. A full 30 minutes passed before the construction crew realized what they'd done. One of the workers shouted, "Kill the equipment! It's breaking through!" The bulldozer stopped. The cement mixers went quiet. Men scrambled across the slope, trying desperately to pile rocks against the new runoff path. But the soil was too wet, too loose, too unstable. The water carved deeper, wider, faster. At one point, the hillside trembled. A chunk of the newly added dirt slid down in a shallow landslide, tearing through a fence panel and scattering across the orchard's edge. One worker jumped aside just in time. Karen covered her mouth, eyes wide. "You caused this," I said to her across the distance. She shouted something, but the wind drowned it out. And maybe that was for the best. That night, after the water finally slowed, I inspected the damage with a flashlight. Dozens of trees had soaked in water that shouldn't have touched them. Leaves had already begun curling in that telltale chemical way. The soft, almost slimy texture of the soil told me everything I needed to know. It was contaminated too. Daniel came over early the next morning. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood with me, hands on hips, looking down at the orchard. "This isn't negligence anymore," he finally said. "This is gross negligence, recklessness, willful disregard. Karen tried to cover it up," I said. "Well, she's failing." He pointed to the collapsed slope. "That's a structural failure. The county will have a field day with this." "And the contamination?" I asked. Daniel exhaled deeply. "We document everything, every inch, every tree, every water path. This is exactly the kind of disaster that wins environmental cases." But I wasn't thinking about lawsuits in that moment. I was thinking about the orchard, about the trees showing new signs of stress, about the patches of soil that would need to be excavated or remediated, about the certification I'd lost. Karen had no idea what she'd done, or maybe she knew exactly what she'd done, and hoped she could bury it under enough soil, lies, and HOA talking points that no one would ever trace the damage back to her. But she didn't count on me. She didn't count on the cameras. She didn't count on the environmental report spreading online. And she certainly didn't count on the HOA board turning on her. Because the next day, as I walked up to check the slope again, I heard raised voices, angry, sharp, panicked voices coming from Karen's driveway. The HOA board had arrived, and judging by the volume of the argument, they were not on Karen's side anymore. When I reached the top of the slope, I found the entire HOA board standing in Karen's driveway like an angry tribunal. Their perfectly curated suburban calm had dissolved into frantic arguing. Laura, normally so meek and apologetic, was pointing aggressively at the damaged hillside, her voice shaking with anger. Weston paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, as if trying to physically pull answers out of thin air. And Karen, well, Karen looked like a trapped animal. She kept adjusting her blazer, smoothing her hair, fidgeting, compensating for the panic bubbling beneath the surface. Laura was the first to notice me approaching. For once, she didn't flinch. She looked furious at the situation, furious at Karen, furious at the mountain of consequences about to bury them all. "Mike," she called out, her voice tight. "We need to talk." Karen whirled around. "No, we don't. He's the one causing problems." Laura shut her down with a glare I'd never seen from her before. "Karen, enough." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Laura turned away, dismissing her entirely. That moment alone told me everything. The board wasn't defending their queen anymore. They were preparing to overthrow her. Weston walked up, holding a clipboard full of inspection photos. "We reviewed the drainage system," he said, avoiding eye contact, or what's left of it. He flipped the clipboard around so I could see. The images showed clear violations: improper slope grading, unauthorized pipe alterations, and the unstable berm Karen had ordered the construction crew to build. "This isn't what was approved," he said. "Not even close." Karen lunged toward him, grabbing the clipboard. "You're not supposed to show him that!" Laura snatched it back. "Karen, stop! This is a disaster, and you know it." Karen's face reddened. "I know nothing of the sort. This is sabotage. He's been trying to destroy my project from the start. He hates the HOA. He hates progress." I crossed my arms. "Progress shouldn't kill orchards. You poison your own orchard," Karen snapped. Trying to frame me so you can sue? Weston let out a bitter chuckle. Karen, water doesn't flow uphill. Her jaw tightened. You're all turning against me because he made a few signs and took some dramatic photos. Photos? Laura stepped forward, holding up her phone. Karen, the entire hillside collapsed. You destroyed part of your own fence. And the runoff is visible from space on Google Earth once the next update hits. She paced in front of the group, exasperated. This isn't minor. This isn't cosmetic. This is illegal. Karen's voice cracked. You're exaggerating. But she wasn't. And deep down, Karen knew it. That's when Daniel arrived. He stepped out of his truck with the confidence of a man walking into a courtroom he'd already won. His briefcase swung casually at his side as he approached the group. The HOA board stared at him the way civilians stare at a bomb technician, hopeful but terrified of what he might reveal. Good morning, Daniel said pleasantly. I hear we're discussing drainage. Karen nearly choked on air. Why is he here? I invited him, I said. Daniel opened his briefcase, pulled out printed lab results, and handed copies to each board member. Chlorine levels recorded in the runoff range from 2.8 to 3.4 ppm. That's enough to violate state agricultural codes and federal organic certification standards. Weston scanned the numbers, his face draining of color. This is bad. Laura pressed a hand to her forehead. This could shut down the entire HOA water system. Daniel nodded. Oh, absolutely, and given how close the pond is to the community pool, you might have health department involvement too. Karen snapped. You don't know what you're talking about. Daniel smiled politely. I specialize in this, actually, but please continue, she sputtered, spinning toward the board. Why are you all letting him take over? He's manipulating you. But the board wasn't listening to her anymore. They were circling the drain figuratively, unlike Karen's pond, which circled my orchard literally. I noticed Laura scrolling through her phone, her lips tightening into a thin line. Karen, she said quietly, did you reject the original contractor proposal to reroute the drainage system? Karen froze. What? It says here, Laura held up her phone, that the initial design was environmentally compliant. But there are notes indicating someone signed KJ refused the reroute due to cost and delays to aesthetic goals. Karen's face went pale. That must be fake. It's from your HOA email, Weston said. It's your signature. Karen stepped back, trembling. No, I didn't. That's not... You don't understand. The board members exchanged glances that said they had finally recognized the truth. Karen had gambled with their money, their liability, their reputations. And now she was drowning. Daniel placed another stack of papers on the hood of Karen's SUV. We have all the evidence we need to file a lawsuit for damages, remediation costs, and recertification expenses. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But the county and state agencies will likely file their own investigations as well. Karen shook her head violently. No, no, no. You can't. This is my project. I did everything right, Laura's voice cracked. You lied to us, Weston added. You lied to everyone. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for an ally. There were none. I did this for the community, she screamed. You did this for yourself, I said quietly. Something inside her snapped. I could see it the moment she realized nothing she said could undo the truth, and like a cornered animal, she lashed out. She pointed at me and shrieked, You tricked them! You ruined everything! You destroyed my pond! Before I could respond, Daniel stepped forward. No, Karen. You destroyed your own project by ignoring basic environmental safety standards. Karen turned wild-eyed toward the board. You're going to let him talk to me like that? Laura sighed deeply. Karen, we're voting this afternoon on your removal as HOA president. The world seemed to stall. The wind stopped. Even the birds went silent. Karen's face became a mask of horror. You can't remove me. I am the HOA. Weston shook his head. Not anymore. Karen staggered backward, gripping the railing of her porch as if holding on to the last piece of her collapsing empire. You can't do this, she whispered, barely audible. I gave everything to this community. You cost us everything, Laura replied. Karen opened her mouth to speak again, but the words never came. She turned away from us, shoulders shaking, not with tears, but with a rage so overpowering she couldn't express it. Daniel gathered his papers. We'll send over the official complaint and settlement proposal before mediation. Karen spun around hysterically. There will be no mediation. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Then there will be a trial. She froze. She knew that was the one thing she couldn't survive. Not legally, not socially, not financially. Later that afternoon, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. They didn't even bother hiding the result. The whole neighborhood heard the yelling, the vote count, and Karen's final, defeated scream of outrage. She was removed. And the HOA, desperate to survive the fallout, agreed to mediation immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, the scales tipped fully in my favor. Karen had built her drainage pond to elevate herself, to polish her reputation, boost her status, and cement her role as the all-powerful queen of the HOA. But in the end, she didn't just dig a pond. She dug her own grave. Mediation day arrived on a cold January morning, the kind where the air feels sharp enough to cut through your coat. I woke before sunrise, not because I was nervous, although maybe a part of me was, but because 30 years of farming had hardwired my body to greet the day before the sun did. I walked the orchard with a flashlight, checking the trees out of habit. Even the damaged rows looked peaceful under the early light, as if they were waiting for justice just as patiently as I was. Daniel met me in the driveway, his breath forming little clouds in the cold air. He had a calmness about him, the kind of confidence you only see in someone who knows exactly how the next 8 hours will go. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." We drove to the mediation center, a building that tried too hard to look friendly with pastel-painted walls and motivational posters. Inside, the conference room was already half full. The HOA board members sat together, stiff and pale, like students waiting outside a principal's office. When Karen walked in, the room temperature seemed to drop a few more degrees. She looked nothing like the polished HOA queen she used to be. Her hair was pulled back messily, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, and her bright blazer had been swapped for a dull gray coat. She clutched a stack of papers as if they were a shield. Our eyes met. There was no smugness left, no triumph. Just resentment and fear woven together into a single expression. Her lawyera younger man with slicked back hair and an expensive suit guided her to a seat across from me. He gave me a polite nod. Karen refused to look my way. The mediator entered, a woman with reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and the kind of presence that made everyone sit up straighter. She introduced herself, explained the rules, and then asked each side to give an opening statement. Daniel went first. He laid everything out with the precision of a surgeon. Timeline, evidence, impact. He showed photos of my orchard before and after contamination. He displayed the lab results. He projected drone footage showing the runoff carving through the hillside. Then he presented the internal HOA emails, the smoking gun. The ones with Karen's initials. The ones that proved she'd rejected the safe drainage design to save money and meet her aesthetic timeline. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply revealed the truth piece by piece, letting the facts crush the room under their own weight. When he finished, the mediator nodded. "Thank you." "HOA, your statement," Karen's lawyer cleared his throat. "We acknowledge there were construction issues and unforeseen slope failures, but my client Daniel slid another document forward. This email is dated 2 months before the construction even began. The issues were foreseen." The lawyer froze. Laura leaned forward, rubbing her forehead as if she had a headache that started last month and never left. "We didn't know," she whispered. "She told us the reroute was unnecessary." Karen shot her a glare sharp enough to cut steel. The lawyer scrambled to regain footing. Even if there was knowledge of potential issues, the HOA made decisions. As a collective, Daniel interrupted again. "That's not what these messages suggest." He pointed at a line in the email chain. "Board doesn't need full details. We move forward now." Signed, KJ. The room went silent. The lawyer looked betrayed. Karen looked cornered. The board members looked like they regretted every meeting they ever attended with her. The mediator turned to Karen. "Do you want to respond to this?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Her throat bobbed. Her voice came out hoarse and small. I was trying to do something good for the community," she said. "The project was meant to improve property values." Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm. She shook him off. "I didn't think the runoff would actually hurt anything," she continued. "It's just water. It's not like I intended to destroy his orchard. It was chemically treated water," I said quietly. "You knew that." Karen's jaw tightened. You were being difficult every step of the way. You refused to cooperate with the HOA, and you mocked my leadership. And you kept acting like your orchard mattered more than the entire community. It mattered more than your ego, Daniel said. Karen slammed her hands on the table. You don't understand what it's like to manage a whole neighborhood. The pressure, the expectations. Everyone always wants something, and I was the one who had to deliver. No one asked you to build a pond, Laura said sharply. Karen stared at her. I wanted people to see what I could do, to finally appreciate me. The confession hung in the air, brittle and heavy. The mediator waited a long moment before speaking. Let's discuss compensation. Daniel slid another folder across the table. We're asking for $380,000. That includes crop losses, soil remediation, recertification costs, legal fees, and environmental restoration. Karen's lawyer sputtered. This is excessive. Here are the breakdowns, Daniel said. All documented. The mediator reviewed the packet silently. These numbers are reasonable. HOA. Do you have a counteroffer? Laura whispered to the board members. They whispered back. Weston looked ready to cry. After a few minutes, Laura took a deep breath and said, We accept. Karen whipped around. What? You can't accept that. We can fight this. The board ignored her. Her lawyer whispered, Karen, the evidence is overwhelming. No, I won't let him win. She pointed at me, her finger trembling. He ruined my reputation. He humiliated me in front of the entire town. He sabotaged me. I didn't sabotage you, I said. You sabotaged yourself. Her breathing grew erratic. For a moment, I wondered if she might actually faint. The mediator cleared her throat. The HOA has agreed to the settlement. Let's move forward. Karen collapsed into her chair, hands covering her face. The board signed the settlement documents. Daniel signed on my behalf. I signed last. Karen refused to sign anything, so the board signed under HOA authority. And just like that, the war was over. The HOA would cut me a check for $380,000 within 60 days. They would also pay for an entirely new drainage system, built by a reputable contractor, approved by the county. Karen's pond, scheduled for removal. The entire structure would be dug up and replaced with a compliant system designed specifically to avoid runoff into my orchard. The HOA board issued a formal apology, both privately and publicly. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Comments, whispers, and relief filled the air. People seemed grateful someone had finally stood up to Karen. As for Karen, she disappeared from the community for a while. No more porch meetings, no more barking orders, no more nightly patrols pretending to enforce imaginary rules. She kept her curtains closed, her lights dim, and her head down. Weeks passed. One afternoon, as I was pruning a newly planted row of saplings, future generations of the orchard, I saw her at the ridge, standing quietly, staring at the work crews dismantling her pond. She didn't say anything, and I didn't either. Some battles don't need a final argument. The consequences speak loud enough. When the orchard began showing signs of recovery, when certification officials approved my remediation plan, when the soil tests slowly shifted back toward healthy levels, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. It would take time to rebuild, but I wasn't alone. The community actually started supporting me. People brought organic mulch, compost, and volunteers to help plant new saplings. Even Laura stopped by with a handwritten note apologizing for everything. Karen never apologized, but I didn't need her to, because the truth had already beaten her. And my orchard? It would rise again stronger, healthier, and protected by the very justice she tried so hard to avoid. If there's one thing this entire ordeal taught me, it's that protecting what you love requires courage. Not the loud kind, not the flashy kind, but the quiet, stubborn kind that gets up every day and refuses to bow to injustice. Karen thought power came from titles, board meetings, and HOA politics. But real power comes from truth, persistence, and the willingness to stand your ground even when the odds feel impossible. Land remembers, effort matters, and nothing, absolutely nothing, can replace the legacy of hard work and integrity. So let me ask you this. Have you ever faced someone who tried to control you or push you around? Drop your story in the comments. I read all of them. And if you enjoy these real-life HOA battles and justice stories, hit that subscribe button and join the community. Your support helps this channel grow, and trust me, there are many more wild stories to come.